The word legend derives from the word legendary, which baffles me on how some companies actually push their games out as a legend. Because one, it's fiction, and two, it's Skyward Sword. Legend of Zelda is a series of games that millions of Nintendo fans hold close to their hearts. Now, as your local Nintendo fan, what does that make me? A bystander. I've never really gotten into these games as much as almost every other Nintendo franchise. You can catch me playing Kirby Mass Attack every other day, but you'd find me dead in the ground before you catch me playing Link's Awakening. It's mostly because when I start playing these games, I have to make a commitment to finish it, because if I ever stop playing, it's really hard to get back on top of things. This is mostly because of how many things you have to remember, where you are in the story, what you last did, and what heart containers haven't I collected. The first Legend of Zelda game I beat in its entirety was Breath of the Wild, and I feel like that's the case for quite a few people. That's because this game is absolutely incredible, and accomplished exactly what it set out to do. It's a large open world that can be explored at your own pace. But how did this all get started exactly? Well, that's embarrassing. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is seen to many as one of the greatest games of all time, and easily one of the best games on the Nintendo 64. Super Mario 64 had revolutionized the platforming genre, and successfully transferred the 16-bit plumber to an era of 3D gaming. But The Legend of Zelda's move to 3D would be a lot simpler. With Zelda, all you really need to do is add another axis, unlike Super Mario 64 where they added an extra axis, as well as making it completely different from just getting to the end of a level. Zelda could still keep several aspects of its identity, while still staying true to its original formula. This all sounds like it'd be a great game, and it was scheduled to be released in 1997. What could possibly go wrong? You've gotta be kidding me. The 64DD is possibly one of Nintendo's greatest failures. It was an add-on for the Nintendo 64 that was exclusive to Japan, and it sold horribly. Ocarina of Time was originally planned for the 64DD, but because Nintendo couldn't make up their minds that day, the 64DD didn't release till 1999, and several factors culminated in Ocarina of Time only getting a cartridge release. So the game was delayed to 1998 and went on to become an instant classic, even getting a sequel on the same system. This game had an unprecedented impact on the series and 3D gaming as a medium. It really showed that 3D games didn't have to fit into the mold of a platformer. It could be an adventure game, a racing game, or even a stupid game. People love this game, but I've only picked it up and ran all the way through it just recently. So, how do I feel about it? It's no Glover, but it does the job. I'm a bit fuzzy on the details, but this game opens with... great. So I'm woken out of bed, which is never fun on a Saturday, and apparently the great Deku tree is dying. So naturally, you have to explore his insides. Nope! You do that, and beat up some bug thing along the way, and now the great Deku tree is all fine and good, and oh. He's... dead. Well, moving on. So we get out of there, and we head over to Hyrule Castle. This is a breaking and entering, and we talk to Princess Zelda, who tells us that she thinks that guy is evil, and the spiritual stones are the keys to the Sacred Realm, which is home to the Triforce, which is just a bunch of really powerful triangles. And triangles are already powerful as is, so I can't imagine the amount of power that these triangles have. As for the structure of the game, you go from dungeon to dungeon, solving puzzles and going through trials of combat. The game is split up into 3 dungeons, each having a boss, heart container, and one of the 3 spiritual stones. Inside the Deku Tree is a great starter dungeon, but it doesn't have much to it outside of existence. It teaches the player everything they need to know going forward, and is a great starting point for the introduction of Zelda dungeons into 3D. But still, it isn't much. The Dodongo Cavern is a good enough dungeon, having a fair number of interesting puzzles and challenges, but like the Deku Tree, it doesn't have all too much. Although I can say that this is my favorite dungeon so far. The point still stands. Jabu-Jabu's belly isn't a bad dungeon per se. It just stinks. It isn't very fun to go through, so it's a good thing it goes by pretty quickly if you know what you're doing. I don't. There isn't much of a story goal in those last 2 dungeons. It's just the starvation of a species and rescuing a child from being eaten alive, which sounds more serious when you say it out loud. But the game was honestly shorter than I thought it would be, so let's head over to Zelda and give her the... Oh, that's weird. I mean, I do like shiny objects, so I don't mind if I do. And then we play a fun little tune in the Temple of Time, and we finally get to see the Sacred Realm. we are now told that we're an adult. Oh, come on, I still have a few more years. And it's the future. I knew that fortune meant something. So now the game is about finding the other 5 sages and freeing Hyrule from the clutches of Ganon, who has destroyed and corrupted much of the land. It's okay, Whiplash isn't that deadly. And the game continues from there, as we now have to travel all over the land in order to conquer all of its dungeons. First up is the Forest Temple, and I love this temple. It's just the right amount of mind-boggling, not to the point where I have to trudge my way through Google, but enough to where I go, what was that? Next on the list is the Fire Temple. Honestly, I kinda blacked out on this one. It wasn't all too memorable, but it was pretty decent. Just nothing I'm dying to go through again. Then, the most infamous Zelda dungeon of them all. And I'm not afraid to say that. Inside the Well sucks. I mean, it's a fine enough scene setter for how dark and damp the game can get, but honestly, I don't care that much for it. Oh yeah, the Water Temple exists. I think that this is the dungeon that I have the most mixed feelings on. On one hand, it's the dungeon that gets me to think more thoughtfully of its puzzles and layout, as well as the best way to get through all of its traps. On the other hand, it's painfully boring and slow. This dungeon doesn't have an incredible flow to it, as you'll be taking your iron boots off and putting them back on, taking them off and putting them back on, taking them off and... what was it again? Oh yeah, putting them back on. I would say this is the most divisive dungeon in the series, but saying it's the worst is a bit much. Then the Shadow Temple. For one, this ship reminds me a lot of Rainbow Ride from Super Mario 64, and 2, DK Bongos. Because of that, this dungeon is a pass. And then, the Spirit Temple. There was a giant statue, and that was the Spirit Temple. And finally, Ganon's Castle. A culmination of every temple, even one that doesn't exist. Because existence is for the weak. And it all caps off with a fight with Ganon. Credits. So that was Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And as a person who doesn't really play Zelda games, it was pretty good. But we're not done yet. I still have to talk about the items. And while that might sound menial, these have a great purpose, and it impacts the game's mechanics very impressively. I'll only go over the important ones though. You don't want me talking about empty bottles for the next 4 hours, do you? The sword and shield play an extremely important role in combat, which is kind of obvious. It's like saying water is wet. See? No controversy at all. And the combat in itself is fine. Nothing offensive. It's just like the IRS. I don't really have an opinion on it. The slingshot is a slingshot, alright. There aren't too many uses for it aside from toggling switches and killing spiders, but this thing is completely replaced by the boomerang, because the boomerang can grab objects. And that's about it. The bow and arrow is mostly just a refined slingshot. It does everything the slingshot does, but better. It's a bit easier to aim personally, and it can be equipped with all sorts of magic spells. Bombs. They're bombs. They explode. They work like bombs. I can't really say anything else about them. Beans. Come back to me when you have more pizzazz. Magic beans. Now that's more like it. These can be planted in certain places in the past in order for them to grow into rideable flowers in the future. They mostly lead to heart pieces. Speaking of which, heart pieces are scattered all throughout the land, and while some can be quite hidden, going for all of them really helps in the long run. The iron boots and hover boots are mostly for people who are insecure about their weight, but they do have their uses in the game. The iron boots are used to sink to the bottom of any body of water, while the hover boots let you float over a cliff for a little bit. And while the iron boots could be useful and fun to use, the hover boots aren't fun or useful. I mean, it's fine enough when I cheat death, but most of the time, it's a slip and slide funk fest. And the option to overcome the grave doesn't come up all too often, so I never found this item all too great. The hookshot is pretty useful though. It can be used to grab onto certain ledges in order to pull yourself up to them. It can also be used to kill enemies and grab items. So it's basically a better boomerang. And those were all the important... The Ocarina of Time is the headlining item in this game. It can be used to make things happen through the power of song. Things like the sun, a horse, or perhaps a bit of nonsense. And while it is hard to remember all of the Ocarina songs by memory, you can always go in the menu to remember how to be important again. Those were all the items, and while some could just be considered upgrades to others, some can only be used by young Link, and some can only be used by adult Link. Which brings us to the time switching mechanic. After a certain point, you can switch back and forth through time willy-nilly. It doesn't really come up too often in the story, aside from going back in order to go to the bottom of the well, but it is pretty necessary in terms of completing side quests and collecting heart pieces. But on the topic of the story, there isn't much to do outside of it. Yes, there are a few minigames and lots of heart pieces to collect, but there isn't any real motivation to do any of that. So while I do love going for the completion of the main story, going for everything else is a bit much. But regardless, this game is incredible for what it did right, and had an extreme impact on 3D gaming. And as the first 3D Zelda game, it set an example for the rest of the series to follow. While I wouldn't go as far as to say this is one of my favorite games of all time, I will say that this is a game that I can always point to as a consistently good Zelda experience. But there is one part of the game that I haven't talked about. Hyrule Field. It's big, wide, and it has holes. And that's about it. Well, now I don't know what I'm gonna do for the next 2 hours.